The morning sun cast golden rays through the tall windows of Whitmore Palace, illuminating the breakfast room where Princess Isabella, only 8 years old, sat with her mother, Crown Princess Victoria. The little princess wore a beautiful lavender dress with delicate silver embroidery that her grandmother, the late Queen Mother, had commissioned specially for her. Isabella swung her feet happily under the table, excited about the day ahead. Today was the Spring Garden reception, one of the most important social events of the season. Hundreds of noble families would gather in the palace gardens, and Isabella had been practicing her curtsy for weeks. "Remember, darling," Victoria said gently, adjusting the pearl necklace around Isabella's neck. "Stand tall and smile. You represent our family." The little princess nodded seriously, her dark curls bouncing. She loved these special occasions when she could wear her prettiest dresses and meet people from all over the kingdom. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Lady Margaret Thornfield adjusted her own outfit in the mirror. As the daughter of Queen Consort Elisabetta from her previous marriage, Margaret held a unique position in court. She wasn't royal by blood, but her mother's marriage to King Alexander had elevated her status considerably. Margaret frowned at her reflection. At 32, she constantly felt overshadowed by the younger, more popular Crown Princess Victoria. She smoothed down her emerald green dress, chosen specifically to stand out at today's reception. "Mother says we must make a strong impression today," Margaret muttered to her lady's maid. "The nobility must remember that we are now part of the royal family too." The palace buzzed with activity as servants rushed about, preparing for the afternoon's festivities. Florists arranged magnificent displays of roses and peonies, while kitchen staff put finishing touches on delicate pastries and finger sandwiches. In the nursery wing, Princess Isabella's younger siblings, Prince James and Princess Sophia, were being dressed by their nannies. At 6 and 4 years old, respectively, they would only make a brief appearance at the reception before returning to their quarters. Victoria checked her watch, a delicate gold piece that had belonged to her mother. "We should head down to the blue drawing room soon. Your father will want to see you before the guests arrive." Isabella jumped up excitedly. "Will Papa tell me stories about when he was little?" "Perhaps later, sweetheart. Today is a busy day for him." They walked hand in hand through the palace corridors, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Portraits of past monarchs gazed down at them, a reminder of the centuries of tradition they represented. In the blue drawing room, King Alexander stood by the window, reviewing documents with his private secretary. When he heard the door open, his serious expression melted into a warm smile. "There's my little butterfly," he said, bending down to embrace Isabella. "Don't you look splendid today?" Isabella beamed. "Mama says my dress is special because great-grandmama chose it." "Indeed it is," Alexander replied, though Victoria noticed a slight tension in his jaw. The late Queen Mother had often clashed with Elisabetta, and even mentions of her could create awkwardness. Queen Consort Elisabetta entered the room with Margaret close behind. The Queen Consort wore a stunning crimson gown that commanded attention, while Margaret's emerald dress seemed to pale in comparison. "Alexander, darling," Elisabetta said. Her eyes swept over Isabella's outfit, and something flickered across her face. "How quaint. The child is wearing purple to a spring reception?" Victoria's spine straightened. "Lavender is perfectly appropriate for the season, Elisabetta." "Of course," the Queen Consort replied with a tight smile, though perhaps something in pastels would have been more modern. Margaret seized the opportunity. "Mother's right. The young princess should reflect current fashion, not outdated traditions." She looked directly at Isabella. "That dress makes you look like you're attending a funeral, not a garden party." Isabella's face crumpled. She looked down at her beautiful dress, suddenly seeing it differently. The silver embroidery that had seemed so magical now appeared dull and old-fashioned. "Margaret," Alexander's voice carried a warning tone. "That's quite enough." But Margaret, emboldened by her mother's presence, continued. "I'm only trying to help. If the princess appears at social events looking like she's been dressed from the palace archives, what will people think? We must consider the monarchy's image." Victoria's cheeks flushed with controlled anger. She placed a protective hand on Isabella's shoulder. "The monarchy's image has been perfectly well maintained for generations without your input, Margaret." "Times change," Elisabetta interjected smoothly. "Margaret has spent years in Parisian society. She understands contemporary elegance, And I understand the importance of honoring family traditions, Victoria countered. This dress represents our heritage. Isabella stood frozen between the adults, her excitement about the reception evaporating. She felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them back, remembering her mother's lessons about composure. The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Alexander cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss this later. The guests will begin arriving soon. But Margaret wasn't finished. I'm only thinking of Isabella's future. When she's older, she'll thank me for teaching her about proper presentation. That dress might have been suitable 20 years ago. But now, she looks like a relic. The word relic hung in the air like a slap. Isabella's bottom lip trembled. She loved her great-grandmother's dress. It made her feel connected to the wonderful woman who used to read her bedtime stories and teach her about the history of their kingdom. How dare you? Victoria's voice was low but fierce. You forget yourself, Margaret. Isabella is a princess of the blood. She doesn't need fashion advice from someone who bought their way into this family. Elisabetta gasped. Victoria, how vulgar. What's vulgar, Victoria continued, is allowing your daughter to bully a child. Isabella looks beautiful and appropriate, and I won't have anyone, tell her otherwise. Margaret's face flushed red. I was trying to help. You were trying to assert dominance, Victoria interrupted, and using an 8-year-old child to do it. That's not only vulgar, it's pathetic. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel. Isabella pressed closer to her mother, drawing strength from Victoria's protective presence. Alexander finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his crown. This discussion is over. Isabella looks lovely, as always. Margaret, you will apologize to my daughter immediately. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She looked to her mother for support, but Elisabetta had suddenly become very interested in examining her manicure. I apologize if my comments were misunderstood, Margaret said stiffly. That's not an apology, Victoria said. Try again? Margaret's jaw clenched. I apologize, Princess Isabella. Your dress is fine. Before anyone could respond, the palace's majordomo appeared in the doorway. Your Majesties. The first guests are arriving, Alexander nodded. We'll be there momentarily. He knelt down to Isabella's level. My darling girl, you look absolutely perfect. That dress was chosen with love, and you wear it beautifully. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Isabella managed a small smile. Thank you, Papa. As they prepared to leave for the reception, Victoria caught Elisabetta's arm. If your daughter ever speaks to my child that way again, you'll find that my influence in this palace extends far beyond what you might imagine. Elisabetta's practiced smile never wavered. Of course, dear Victoria. We're all family here. But as they walked toward the gardens, the battle lines had been clearly drawn. The spring garden reception, meant to be a celebration of renewal and growth, had instead become the opening salvo in a palace war. The palace gardens were a vision of spring splendor. Hundreds of guests in their finest attire mingled among the blooming roses and carefully manicured hedges. Servants circulated with silver trays of champagne and delicate canapés, while a string quartet played softly near the fountain. Princess Isabella walked beside her mother, trying to recapture her earlier excitement. But Margaret's cruel words echoed in her mind, making her feel self-conscious about every step she took. She noticed people looking at her and wondered if they, too, thought her dress looked like something from a funeral. Victoria sensed her daughter's discomfort and squeezed her hand reassuringly. Chin up, darling. You're a princess. Near the rose garden, a group of noble ladies had gathered, their fans fluttering as they gossiped. Margaret stood at the center, her emerald dress catching the sunlight as she held court. Of course, I've been advising the queen consort on modernizing the palace image, Margaret was saying loud enough for passers-by to hear. Some traditions have simply outlived their usefulness. Take children's fashion, for instance. When I was in Paris last month, I saw the most delightful designs for young girls. So fresh and contemporary, not like the dusty old things some people insist on dragging out of storage. Lady Pemberton, an elderly duchess known for her sharp tongue, raised an eyebrow. Are you referring to something specific, Lady Margaret? Margaret's smile was poisonously sweet. Oh, I wouldn't dream of being specific. But one does notice when certain young members of the royal family appear to be dressed by their great-grandmother's ghosts. A few ladies tittered nervously, while others looked uncomfortable. They all knew Margaret was talking about Princess Isabella, who was beloved by most of the nobility. Across the garden, the Countess of Ashford approached Victoria and Isabella. The Countess was one of Victoria's closest friends and Isabella's godmother. "Victoria, darling," the Countess said, kissing both cheeks. Then she bent down to Isabella. "My dear princess, how absolutely enchanting you look. Is that one of the Queen Mother's pieces?" Isabella nodded shyly. "Yes, Lady Catherine. But Lady Margaret says it makes me look old-fashioned." The Countess's eyes flashed. "Does she now?" "Well, I say it makes you look like exactly what you are, a true princess with a connection to her heritage. Not everyone can carry off such elegance, you know. It takes breeding." Her words were kind, but Victoria caught the steel underneath. The Countess had never approved of Elisabetta's marriage to the king, viewing her as a social climber. "Catherine," Victoria said quietly. "Not here." "Of course not," the Countess replied. "But really, Victoria, how long will you tolerate that woman's daughter speaking to Isabella that way?" Before Victoria could answer, they were joined by Lord Pemberton, the Duke of Ashford, and several other high-ranking nobles. They all made a point of complimenting Isabella's appearance, their message clear. The old nobility stood with the crown princess and her daughter. Meanwhile, Margaret had gathered her own allies, mostly newer members of court who owed their positions to Elisabetta's influence. She continued her campaign of subtle criticism, each comment designed to undermine Isabella's confidence. "Poor little thing," Margaret said to Lady Worthington, a young baroness eager to curry favor. "It's not her fault she's being dressed like a Victorian doll. Children have no say in these matters." Queen Consort Elisabetta glided through the crowd, playing the gracious hostess while carefully noting who aligned with whom. She paused near Margaret's group, offering silent support to her daughter's campaign. King Alexander, engaged in diplomatic conversations with foreign ambassadors, remained unaware of the growing tension, but Prince Edward, his younger brother, noticed the divided court and made his way to Victoria. "Sister," Edward said quietly, "there seems to be an unusual amount of discussion about children's fashion today." Victoria's smile was tight. "Margaret has decided to make my daughter's dress a matter of state importance." Edward's face darkened. He adored his niece, and had never warmed to his brother's second wife or her daughter. "Shall I intervene?" "Not yet," Victoria replied, "but stay close to Isabella. I have a feeling this afternoon is far from over." As if on cue, Margaret's voice rose above the general conversation. She had positioned herself near the main pavilion, ensuring maximum audience for her performance. "I simply believe," she was saying, "that the royal family should embrace progress. Clinging to the past makes us look irrelevant. Take fashion. For example, when young royals appear in public wearing outmoded styles, it sends a message that we're out of touch with modern society." Several photographers from approved society magazines were present, and Margaret made sure she was perfectly positioned for their cameras. She knew that images from today's reception would appear in tomorrow's papers. Isabella, standing with her Uncle Edward, heard every word. Her small hands clenched into fists, wrinkling the lavender fabric she had been so proud of that morning. "Uncle Edward," she whispered, "do I really look silly?" Edward knelt beside her, his military medals glinting in the sun. "You look like a princess from a fairy tale, little one. And do you know what? Some people are jealous of fairy tale princesses, but the damage was being done." Other children at the reception, hearing the adults' conversations, began whispering among themselves. Isabella saw them pointing and giggling, and her composure finally cracked. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Victoria saw it happen from across the garden. She watched her daughter's shoulders slump, saw the light dim in those bright eyes, and something inside her snapped. The crown princess had spent years navigating palace politics with grace and diplomacy, but watching her child suffer was more than she could bear. She strode across the lawn with purpose, her silk gown rustling with each determined step. Conversations died as she passed, nobles sensing that something significant was about to happen. Victoria stopped directly in front of Margaret, who was still holding forth about modern fashion. The crowd around them fell silent, creating a natural amphitheater for what was to come. "Lady Margaret," Victoria's voice carried clearly across the garden, I believe you've been sharing your opinions about my daughter's attire. Margaret, sensing danger but bolstered by her audience, lifted her chin. I've merely been discussing the importance of contemporary presentation, Your Highness. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? Victoria's laugh was without humor. You've spent the last hour systematically criticizing an 8-year-old child's dress. A dress chosen with love by her great-grandmother, a dress that represents generations of royal tradition. And you call that nothing personal? The crowd held its breath. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, sensing the drama unfolding. Elisabetta appeared at her daughter's side. Victoria, surely this can be discussed privately. No, Victoria interrupted. Your daughter chose to make this public. She wanted an audience for her little performance. Well, she has one. Victoria's gaze returned to Margaret, and her next words rang out like a bell. Let me make something abundantly clear, Lady Margaret. You may have gained a title through your mother's marriage, but you are not royal. You are not a princess. And you are certainly not qualified to judge how I dress my daughter. Margaret's face flushed. I was only trying to help modernize. You were trying to bully a child to make yourself feel important, Victoria continued. And in doing so, you've revealed exactly what you are. A small, petty woman who needs to tear down an 8-year-old to feel significant. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This was unprecedented. The Crown Princess, known for her diplomacy, was delivering a public rebuke that would be gossiped about for years. Furthermore, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger, since you seem so concerned about image and modernity, let me offer you some advice. True elegance isn't about following every Parisian trend. It's about grace, kindness, and knowing when to hold your tongue. Qualities you evidently lack. Margaret looked desperately to her mother for help, but Elisabetta seemed frozen, calculating the political cost of this public humiliation. Victoria wasn't finished. My daughter represents centuries of royal bloodline. Her great-grandmother was a queen who dedicated her life to this kingdom. That dress you mock, it's a symbol of continuity, of respect for those who came before us. But I wouldn't expect you to understand that. After all, your own history begins and ends with your mother's advantageous marriage. The silence in the garden was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Margaret's carefully constructed image of sophistication lay in ruins at her feet. Mama? Isabella's small voice broke the spell. She had approached during her mother's speech, Uncle Edward by her side. Victoria's fierce expression softened as she looked down at her daughter. Yes, darling, I like my dress, Isabella said clearly. Great-grandmama told me it was worn by Princess Amelia at her first garden party. She was brave and kind and helped lots of people. I want to be like her. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. The Countess of Ashford actually applauded, followed by Lord Pemberton and others of the old guard. Victoria smiled and took her daughter's hand. Then you shall be, my love. And you already are. She looked once more at Margaret, who seemed to have shrunk inside her emerald dress. I trust this matter is now closed. And Lady Margaret, if you ever speak to or about my daughter in such a manner again, you'll find that your invitations to palace events will mysteriously stop arriving. With that, Victoria led Isabella away, their heads held high. The crowd parted respectfully, many bowing or curtsying as they passed. The message had been delivered clearly. Cross the Crown Princess's children at your peril. The morning after the garden reception, newspapers across the kingdom buzzed with barely veiled accounts of the palace drama. Crown Princess defends royal traditions, read one headline, while another proclaimed, tension in the palace gardens. Though reporters had been too far away to hear the exact words, the society photographers had captured telling images: Margaret's stricken face, Victoria's protective stance over Isabella, and the clear division between court factions. In her private apartments, Elisabetta paced before the fireplace while Margaret sat slumped on a velvet sofa, still in her dressing gown at 11 in the morning. This is a disaster, Elisabetta muttered, crumpling the morning paper. Years of careful positioning ruined in a single afternoon. She humiliated me, Margaret said, her voice hollow. In front of everyone. How can I show my face at court again? Elisabetta stopped pacing and fixed her daughter with a sharp look. By learning from your mistakes. You overplayed your hand, Margaret. I warned you about subtlety. You supported me. Margaret protested. You said we needed to assert ourselves. Assert, not attack, Elisabetta corrected. There's a difference between establishing our presence and declaring war on an 8-year-old princess. You gave Victoria the moral high ground, and she used it brilliantly. A knock at the door interrupted them. Elisabetta's lady's maid entered, curtsying nervously. Your Majesty. His Majesty requests your presence in his study. Elisabetta's face remained composed, but Margaret saw her mother's hands tremble slightly as she smoothed her morning dress. Tell the king I'll be there shortly. After the maid left, Elisabetta turned to her daughter. Stay here, speak to no one. I'll handle your stepfather. In the king's study, Alexander stood with his back to the door, gazing out at the palace grounds where yesterday's reception had taken place. He didn't turn when Elisabetta entered. Alexander, she began, carefully. Sit down, Elisabetta. His tone was formal, using her full name rather than any endearment. A bad sign. She perched on the edge of a chair, her usual confidence wavering. About yesterday. Yesterday, Alexander turned to face her, his expression grave. Your daughter publicly attacked mine. A child. Elisabetta, an innocent child whose only crime was wearing a dress her great-grandmother had chosen. Margaret meant no harm. She's young and sometimes speaks without thinking. Alexander's eyebrows rose. She's 32 years old, hardly a child herself, and she seemed to think quite carefully about her words, positioning herself for maximum audience. Elisabetta tried another approach. Victoria's response was rather extreme. Don't you think? Such a public scene. Victoria defended our daughter, Alexander interrupted. As any mother would. As you yourself would, I imagine. If someone had attacked Margaret when she was 8, the queen consort fell silent, recognizing the futility of that argument. Alexander moved to sit behind his desk, his fingers steepled. I've been patient, Elisabetta. When we married, I understood there would be adjustments, two families blending, new dynamics to navigate, but I made one thing clear from the beginning. My children were not to be pawns in palace politics. I never intended. What you intended and what happened are two different things, Alexander said firmly. Margaret has been increasingly bold in her criticism of Victoria, and by extension, our children. You've done nothing to discourage it. Yesterday was simply the culmination. What do you want me to do? Elisabetta asked, her usual poise cracking. Margaret will make a formal, public apology to Isabella. Not to Victoria, to Isabella. She will acknowledge that her words were cruel and inappropriate. Furthermore, she will absent herself from palace functions for the next month. Elisabetta gasped. A month. The Derby. The ambassador's ball. She should be grateful it's not permanent exile, Alexander said coldly. Victoria showed remarkable restraint. Another woman might have demanded Margaret be sent away entirely. This is excessive, Elisabetta protested. Society will talk. Society is already talking. The question is whether they'll be discussing Margaret's cruelty or her contrition. Alexander's tone softened slightly. Elisabetta, I care for you. But I love my children above all else. If you cannot ensure that your daughter respects that, then we have a larger problem. Meanwhile, in the nursery wing, Isabella was having breakfast with her siblings when Victoria entered. The little princess looked up hopefully. Mama, may I wear my lavender dress to church on Sunday? Victoria's heart swelled. Of course, darling. You may wear it whenever you like. Even though Lady Margaret says it's old-fashioned? Victoria sat down beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. Isabella, there will always be people who criticize others to make themselves feel better. What matters is how you feel about yourself. Do you like your dress? Isabella nodded firmly. It makes me feel close to great-grandmama. Then that's all that matters. Victoria hugged her close. You showed great courage yesterday. I'm proud of you. Prince James, 6 years old and protective of his sisters, piped up. Is Lady Margaret going to be mean to Bella again? No, Victoria said firmly. She won't. As if to underscore her point, a footman appeared with a silver salver bearing a sealed note. Victoria recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately. The note was brief but significant. Your Royal Highness, I request the honor of an audience with Princess Isabella to offer my sincere apologies. I await your pleasure. Lady Margaret Thornfield. Victoria showed the note to Isabella. Lady Margaret wants to apologize to you. You don't have to see her if you don't want to. Isabella thought for a moment, then straightened her small shoulders. Great-grandmama always said a princess should be gracious. I'll see her. That afternoon, Margaret arrived at the nursery wing looking subdued. Gone was the emerald dress and haughty expression. She wore a simple gray suit and kept her eyes downcast. Isabella received her in the small drawing room adjoining the nursery, with Victoria present but standing back. The little princess sat in her child-sized chair with remarkable dignity. Margaret curtsied deeply, then knelt to be at Isabella's eye level. Your Royal Highness, I come to offer my sincerest apologies. My words yesterday were unkind, untrue, and entirely inappropriate. Your dress is beautiful, and more importantly, it carries the love of your great-grandmother. I was wrong to criticize it, and wrong to hurt your feelings. Isabella studied Margaret's face carefully. Why did you say those things? Margaret seemed taken aback by the direct question. She glanced at Victoria, who remained impassive, then back to Isabella. I was jealous, Margaret admitted quietly. You have something I don't, a real connection to the royal history of this kingdom. I let that jealousy make me cruel, and I'm deeply ashamed. The honesty in her voice seemed genuine, and Isabella's expression softened slightly. Mama says when we make mistakes, we should try to do better next time. Your mother is very wise, Margaret said. I promise you, Princess Isabella, I will do better. Isabella nodded solemnly. Then I forgive you, Lady Margaret. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She had expected childish spite or cold dismissal, not this gracious forgiveness. Thank you, Your Royal Highness. You have a generous heart. As Margaret left, Victoria placed a hand on her shoulder. That took courage, she said quietly. See that you remember this lesson. The weeks following the garden reception saw significant shifts in palace dynamics. Margaret's absence from social events was noticed and discussed. But the story that emerged, thanks to careful management by the palace press office, was one of redemption rather than exile. Margaret's sincere apology to the young princess and her voluntary withdrawal to reflect on her behavior actually improved her standing with many who had witnessed her earlier cruelty. Elisabetta, chastened by her husband's ultimatum, reined in her ambitions and focused on her ceremonial duties. She made a point of complimenting Isabella's appearance at every opportunity, though Victoria noticed these compliments never quite reached her eyes. Isabella, for her part, emerged from the ordeal stronger and more confident. She wore her lavender dress to church that Sunday, and then to a children's charity event the following week. Both times, she was photographed and praised for her elegant appearance and connection to royal tradition. The Countess of Ashford hosted a tea party specifically to celebrate timeless royal fashion, where several noble ladies wore vintage pieces from their own grandmothers. It became something of a movement, with younger aristocrats raiding family archives for historical pieces. You've started a trend, Edward teased Victoria one afternoon, as they watched Isabella play with her siblings in the palace gardens. Margaret wanted to modernize royal fashion, and instead, she's made vintage the height of style. Victoria smiled. Sometimes the old ways are best. But more importantly, Isabella learned she doesn't need anyone's approval to be herself. 3 months later, at the midsummer ball, Margaret was permitted to return to full court activities. She approached Victoria early in the evening, wearing a modest blue gown. Your Royal Highness, Margaret said formally. Thank you for allowing my return. Victoria studied her sister-in-law carefully. Your family, Margaret. But remember, my children are off limits, always. I understand, Margaret replied. And I truly am sorry, not just for the consequences, but for my actions. Isabella showed more grace that day than I've managed in my entire life. Children often do, Victoria said. Perhaps that's why they need our protection. As the evening progressed, the court watched with interest as the two women maintained cordial, if distant, relations. The battle lines drawn in the garden that spring day had not disappeared, but a truce had been established. Near midnight, Isabella appeared briefly at the ball, wearing a gorgeous silk dress in pale rose, another of her great-grandmother's selections. She moved through the crowd with confidence, accepting compliments with grace and charm that belied her young age. Margaret watched from across the room and offered a respectful nod when their eyes met. Isabella nodded back. A tiny princess secure in who she was and where she came from. She's going to be formidable when she's older, Elisabetta murmured to her daughter. She already is, Margaret replied. I learned that the hard way. The palace had returned to its normal rhythms, but the lessons of that spring day remained. In the years that followed, Isabella would face many challenges and critics, but she never again doubted her worth based on others' opinions. She had learned early that true strength came not from following every trend or seeking everyone's approval, but from knowing who you were and standing firm in that knowledge. And whenever she wore something that had belonged to her great-grandmother, she did so with pride, remembering the day her mother stood up for her and the day she learned that kindness and grace could triumph over cruelty and spite. The dress that had caused such drama was eventually displayed in the Palace Museum, with a placard that read, "Worn by Princess Isabella at the Spring Garden Reception, 2024, a reminder that fashion fades, but love and tradition endure." Margaret never criticized anyone's clothing choices again.